But there are what a lot of people don't know is that there are just simply a lot of different kinds of publishers and different ways of publishing, from books to blogs and so forth. And so I'm going to go kind of rapid fire, more rapid fire than I planned to, about the different kinds of places that you can publish and what to expect, and some of the different terms so that you have a vocabulary for publishing. And that's actually why I went to the trouble of having my friend Julia make a Prezi for me. Because there are a lot of terms, and I didn't want to just rattle them off without giving you something to look at besides me. But we're working on this. So let's just, if I can just, I'll do this so that I can see. I'm going to talk first about the different kinds of books that you can publish, and I'm just going to start, since we're at a university, with scholarly and academic books, which really are probably the most boring books that are out there. They cater to a very specialized audience, but some of us here are interested in that, including myself. I have published an academic book. And those kinds of books and the publishers operate very differently from the kinds of books that you think of when you think of what you see on the shelves at Barnes & Noble and so forth. So I want to talk a little bit about how they're different. First of all, you don't get paid to write a scholarly book for the most part. Usually the people who are writing scholarly books are professors, and so they're doing that kind of writing and research as part of their role as a professor. So in that sense, they're kind of getting paid out of their job. And you don't need to have an agent to do this kind of work. You simply have to have expertise in your field. You would have to do some of the other things we'll talk about in terms of making a proposal and so forth. But it's really a very labor-intensive work that you would be contracted to do with an academic publisher. Often they are called university presses, although not always. If you get royalties, it's only after they sell a certain number, like 500, which sounds like not very many, but basically, since only libraries tend to buy these books, most academic books will not earn a lot, if any, royalties for the writer. And you're not usually going to find these books on the shelves. So during the Q&A, if anyone has any questions about those, you can. But those are not the kinds of books that most of us are thinking about when we are talking about books. Okay, something just happened, and I'm not sure what it was. Okay, you're doing your magic, apparently. All right. Okay, so the next kind of book that I'm going to talk about is the most traditional, typical book that you think of when you go to Barnes & Noble. These are the books that are the hardest to get a contract for, to get published. This is the kind of book that most of us think of when we think about usually perhaps having an agent, which I'll talk about more, getting a contract, getting an advance, and those kinds of things. And these are the books that you will find at most major bookstores. This is called commercial or trade publishing. Commercial or trade publishing. Again, these are the terms for the books that you mainly think about when you go to a bookstore. These are the books that make a very few writers very, very rich, like John Grisham, but make most writers who write them not rich at all. Lucky if they perhaps collect, a little bit of a royalty check, because with these books, even if a writer gets an advance on the sales, oftentimes the percentage of the sales that the writer is going to earn is, very, very low, 10 to 15%, and you have to sell an awful lot of books to really make a lot of money. So most writers who even write books that you find, for example, if you go to Sam's Club and you see I have a friend, that just published a book last year, and her books were at Sam's Club, really, really cool and exciting, and a big display. She's a mom, soccer mom. She's not rich. She's written a number of these kinds of books, and it's very exciting to see them all over the country and so forth. But she's not getting rich off of these books. Most of the writers who are writing books that are even published by the major publishers aren't doing it because they're getting rich, but they're doing it because they love writing, and even that is hard work to write the book and to get a contract. Let's see if I can. Okay, I didn't print out my notes, so did we?
I just minimized it.
That's what? Oh, you minimized it? Okay, all right, thank you. That's all right. All right. Let's see. Then the other kind of publishing, there are two kinds that are very close together, and some of my, let's see. Let's see. Just make sure I have this right. Hold on. This is, yeah, you're not seeing this, but I'm seeing this. Okay. Small press publishers. They're called small press, or sometimes independent publishers, and these are very specialized niche publishers. This is actually the kind of publisher that published my current book, TS Poetry Press. They write books of poetry and memoir, literary memoir, spiritual memoir, a very, very small publisher that caters to a very specialized market, and there are quite a few publishers out there like that. But again, they're very specialized, so your book that you might be interested in writing has to really fit their market. These publishers often, they are independently owned. It might be just an individual or a group of individuals that own them. They're not big corporations. Their books often don't show up in the big chain bookstores because they don't market that way. They're growing and flourishing really because of the internet, because promotion and so forth can take place online. It's much less expensive. Books like this will usually not pay in advance, but oftentimes the royalties can be higher because you're not getting the advance. They are usually not for profit, and so and they don't have the kind of overhead that big corporate publishers have. They don't have a huge team. The book that I'm working on now is with with one of the major publishers, so it's going to be a very different experience. And so, I'll be able to compare more to it, but the major trade publisher will have a big team of editors and marketers that will work with the manuscript. In a small press or an independent publisher, there are disadvantages and advantages because I didn't have a team like that working with me, but it gave me more creative control, but it also put more responsibility on my shoulders for doing the promotion, working with the publisher, kind of beating the pavement to get word out there about my book. And when Suzanne talks about social media, that's kind of what I had to do to get the word out about my book because I was working with a small publisher. In some cases, those publishers are usually more likely the ones that won't require an agent. If you go onto the websites of the big trade or commercial publishers, you will often see when you click on submissions, you click on that and you're all excited, and then you see it says, "We do not accept unagented or unsolicited submissions. Here, go to this place where you have to pay a lot of money to submit your manuscript or find an agent or whatever." So it's very discouraging to have that link there and then go and see that. A lot of the independent publishers will accept unsolicited queries. We'll talk about what that is in a minute, or even sometimes manuscripts. But even so, because they're so small, they may not even have time to read your manuscript or give it a second look if it doesn't look very much like something that would fit their market. Nick is going to talk in a little bit about audience, and that's a big part of it is, a publisher is an audience too, and you can't just go out there and just query any publisher out there who exists about your book. If it's not a good fit, you really have to know what the publisher specializes in and know that your manuscript would fit that. How's it looking?
It appears to be an issue with your laptop because I got the system to work normally, and I did replace the cable.
I can accept that.
But at the same time, I didn't see anything that would cause setting-wise on your laptop to...
It happens in my classroom too, so maybe,
Maybe the laptop then.
All right. All right. Well, can we see with the purple on there? Can you see the words on there? Or you want to see the words? Or? It wouldn't hurt, I guess, right? The next kind of publishing that I'm going to talk about is self-publishing using, can you see that? Is that any good? Okay, self-publishing. Both. Oh, I can make it full screen. It's like magic. Ooh, okay. Now, do I press allow there? Allow. Thank you. Thank you. Allow. Okay. All right. Okay. All right. Okay. Self-publishing services. I have it. The next category will be more about self-publishing. But again, because of technology, there are a lot of hybrid services that are available that you can self-publish your work. There are packages out there. But you're going to pay for what they buy. And I'm going to sort of go back and forth between these two. Okay, so the next one's going to be, I'll go back to that one, true self-publishing. Basically, they used to call this vanity publishing. Now it's called self-publishing. And I'm going to probably be more negative about it, and then I'm going to talk about the positives of it. Okay, so in the old days, when it was called vanity publishing, before some of the technologies that we have that exist now, basically, you would go to a publisher and you would pay money to have your book published, which is not, how it works with the big trade and commercial publishers that we talked about before, where you're getting an advance and getting royalties and so forth. And there's really nothing wrong with that, but the disadvantage is simply that because you're paying to have the book published, you're also going to have to do all of the legwork of marketing and selling the book. I do have a friend right now who decided to self-publish a book, and it's a very nice book. I think she just didn't want to go through all of the, it's a devotional, and she didn't just want to go through all of the, if she's doing it more for her, she just wanted to get it out there. And now the last message I got from her is she says, well, I have a garage full of books right now, and I don't know what to do with them. And so you can pay to have your book published, and that may be fine and dandy, but you have to be prepared to do what comes next, which is to get those boxes of books out of your garage. And so in the meantime, because of advances in technology and so forth, there are services that you can buy. So in other words, you can actually now pay to have your book published, but also pay for the marketing services and so forth, and that solves that problem. It, of course, requires more money. But you also need to be aware, I just want to caution you, there's a reason why they call it vanity publishing, because it can feed into, a lot of us have this idea that we want to be writers or we want to be published, and those aren't necessarily the same thing. I mean, because you can be a writer and write until the cows come home without being published. But if you just simply want to be published without necessarily having anyone else who wants to read what you've published, then it can become an act of vanity. That's really where that's coming from. But in the meantime, because so many people want to be published, it's gotten harder and harder and harder to get a contract with one of the traditional publishing companies, and a lot of people actually do have good ideas and good works out there to be published and can't, for whatever reason, get the attention, or they don't. I know with the book that I had out, it just, I believed in the book, and a lot of other people believed in the book, but it doesn't fit any of the niches that are already out there with the big trade companies. So when I was originally trying to get the book published, it did actually get to the editorial boards of a number of those big companies, but when it came down to it, they said it was a book about books. It was literary and spiritual, and those things just there's no market for that already exists. And so, so I wasn't able to sell it to one of the big publishers. I did find one of the independent publishers who serves a niche. And so that's not to say, so if people can have good, worthy material that just isn't going to get picked up by a big traditional publisher, And so there are these services available, but it's important for people to know what they are and what the differences are. And that if you're paying for your book to be published, then you have to be prepared to take the responsibility on that goes along with it. Let's see. Let's see. And then, of course, if you do well with it, there's a famous example of The Shack, which was a self-published book, and that book made the author a whole lot of money because nobody wanted to publish that, so he just self-published it and he got all the money. And all the people who didn't, who turned it down probably got fired. I don't know. So we're going to move on from books to magazines. We've got some magazines out here for you to pick up from Christianity Today. And magazine writing can be a really good way to develop your writing career or to get published, although magazines can be very hard to get into. There are basically 3 categories of magazines. The first that is, again, the kind of magazine you think about when you go to Barnes & Noble and you see them on the rack, and those are consumer magazines like the one that you have in front of them. You go to the bookstore and they're there, and they sort of, even though they might target a certain audience, they're just available on a wide scale. And then there are trade and professional magazines, the kind that you actually don't see much in the bookstore, but people who, work on the railroad buy this magazine. They don't sell it at Barnes & Noble, but they're out there. Some of you probably work in professions that have those magazines, and somebody's got to write for them, and they do. And then in-house publications are newsletters or magazines that are for corporations. And there are a lot of big corporations out there that use them, and they often hire freelance writers to write for them. Magazine writing can be hard to break into as well. We're going to move down to talking about writing for websites and blogs. That's how I broke into magazine writing. And the pay can vary a great deal. There's a famous episode of a show that I won't mention where that involves a writer, and she brags about how, and this is going back some years, about how Vogue offered her $2 a word, but she talked them into $4 a word. And this was like years ago. Some of you know what I'm talking about. And that was like a really big deal. $4 a word, I just want you to know that's, we're talking in fractions, very small fractions of that we get paid a word. So unless you're writing for Vogue, you're probably getting pennies compared to that. But on the other hand, that is a valid and important part of a writing career to write for magazines. But often before you get to that point, a great way, probably the best way to break into writing is to write for websites. Now, I did a fair amount of research into this, and I just want you to know that there isn't a whole vocabulary out there, unless someone else knows it and I don't, but I could not find a vocabulary for all the different kinds of websites out there. So there are websites that are major websites like Huffington Post or The Atlantic or CNN.com that are national and that everyone reads, and then there are websites that that we've never heard of, and they put news and analysis out there. They're very smaller niche audiences. All of them are called websites, and that's all I could say about that. So I just kind of broke them into the 2 categories of the ones that that are big and national and that we've heard of, other ones that are maybe you haven't heard of, but are doing quality kinds of writing and analysis, like Christ and Pop Culture, which Nick has written for and served as editor for. All those are great places that are competitive, actually, that not just anyone can write for. I mean, they're usually open to proposals and pitches and queries, but it takes some effort to get published there, and it's a very worthwhile effort. Some of them pay, some of them don't. None of them that I know of pay a lot. But it's a very good way for you to break into writing. And then the other thing that is, of course, just personal blogging. And I'll say something very opinionated about personal blogs, because those of you who know me know I'm very opinionated. I think a personal blog is an excellent way for you to practice writing. You could also do that in a journal that has a lock and a key. And a lot of personal blogs would be better off written in a journal that has a lock and a key, okay? And again, I don't want to step into what Nick's going to talk about when he talks about writing for audience, but this is how I kind of want to sum up everything that I'm going to say about all of this writing that we're talking about. Unless you are writing for yourself, which is a very legitimate thing to do, processing, honing your writing skills, thinking about things, exercising personal demons, whatever it might be, and you are an audience for yourself, that's considered I remember communication 101 from college, and yourself as an audience, that's a legitimate audience. But apart from that, whether you're writing for a little blog that no one's ever heard of, but you got a devoted band of readers, or you're writing for a huge publisher or a big glossy magazine like Vogue, you're writing for an audience, not for yourself. And that's always going to determine, which publisher, which format is appropriate for your writing. So again, Nick's going to talk more about audience after I speak, but audience is important even with all of these different formats. So just a couple more slides, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers. Oh, there. Just a literary agent, I wanted to throw that in there. I'll just sum it up by saying it's as hard to find a literary agent or just to get a literary agent as it is to find a publisher. Oftentimes when you go to their websites and you say, oh, queries or hire me or whatever, you click on the link and it says we're not accepting any unsolicited queries or whatever. It can be very, very hard to find an agent. But you can, and Susie Q is going to talk about this, network with them online and so forth. I mean, that is actually how I got my book published, even with the independent publisher, which if you go to that press and you click on submissions, it says that they do not accept unsolicited manuscripts. It was actually through a lady at my church. That's another story. But that relationship was developed through social media. So social media is a really good way to build these kinds of relationships. Networking with other authors, going to writers' conferences. Usually, if you go to writers' conferences where all these people go, and you meet them and they give you your card and say, email me, there you go. That's really the best way. But if you just go on their website and decide to send a random person an email because you're too lazy to go to a writers' conference or whatever, then they won't even look at your email. You really do have to do the sort of pounding the pavement work of networking with them. And again, going back to the kind of publisher that you're going with, some require agents and some don't. This book that I'm working on now, I was able to get the contract without an agent, and I made the decision after I got the contract, or when I knew I was getting the contract, to hire an agent, because I figured it was cheaper than hiring a lawyer, because I needed somebody to read the contract. And I wanted someone to be my advocate, because that's partly what agents do. So maybe I didn't need to do that, but I'm not in it for the money. I just wanted to make sure that I was, that I would have someone to be my advocate. All right, and then just a couple, I think I'm sorry, I'm not good at clicking the buttons. Okay. All right, a query, you've heard me mention that a couple of times. Oops, go back. That is actually the starting place for contacting any publisher with an idea that you have. There are some tips here, and I have websites at the end that I'll tell you where you can go for more information. A query is just like what it sounds. It's like a question. It's not even a proposal. A proposal comes next. It can often be, this makes it sound like it's longer. Kate may talk about this later, but I tend, queries often can be very, very short, shorter than this. But basically, it's your one chance to sell your idea to the publisher that you've well researched, and you know that their audience matches your audience. And so you're sending them a very specific story idea that has an effective lead. That's sort of the introduction. And of course, it doesn't say this in here, but you, of course, have no grammar or writing errors at all, of course. That goes without saying. It gives some other information, support the body of it, be factual, and also explain why you're the best person to write this, whether it's because of your perspective, your experience, your professional expertise, whatever it might be. You're not just selling the idea, you're selling yourself too, because everybody out there wants to be a writer. And your idea might be great, but why are you the best person to write this story? That's part of the idea. The other thing I want to say, because I know we're going fast and running out of time, but the other thing I want to say is everything you need to know about writing is in the writer's market. The writer's market is a place, it's updated every year, so it'll say the writer's market 2013. And it will give all of the publishers all the contact information, whether they accept unsolicited manuscripts, queries, or proposals. And even in the beginning, it's been a long time since I've looked at it, but it gives a lot of tips about how to write a query and how to write a proposal. So this isn't rocket science, as I said before. And almost, if you just go out there and start Googling things about how to write a query, how to write a proposal, you'll find great stuff. Just check a couple places, because most of them are going to say pretty much the same thing. It's not really, this is not the hard part of writing. And then I just, whoops, there, okay. Have some sources here for you. And in the very few minutes that we have left, you can take a break if you need to, but I'll take questions and answers. I'll take questions and maybe give answers, I guess.
And I'll be back here with a microphone.
So everyone can hear, yeah.
Everybody can hear the question, and to scare you off from asking anything.
We've got one over here. Yeah.
How much of your book was written before it was published?
That's an excellent question. Okay, the rule for that, and you can Google it pretty much, is for nonfiction, you are not supposed to write more than a few sample chapters before you get a publisher. For fiction, because now this is just me making it up, but I just want to say it's probably because fiction writers are like so creative and lazy, or whatever, that they want to, the whole thing has to be written. That's just a joke. Don't be offended. So with a work of fiction, the whole thing has to be written. And nonfiction, the reason a nonfiction work should have only a few chapters written is because in nonfiction, the publisher has a much more, your idea could be adapted to different publishers, and the publisher that picks it will greatly shape how it looks. And that was so true in my case. I had actually written a few more chapters than I should have. And the publisher that I ended up with wanted me to emphasize the memoir and the literature more and the spirituality less, and also be a little bit less evangelical in my writing. So I really did have to go back and kind of reshape some chapters. I mean, it wasn't the worst thing in the world, but I was really glad that I hadn't written the whole thing. So nonfiction, a few sample chapters; fiction, the whole thing. Good question. Other questions?
At one point you mentioned that when an author is published through self-publishing that they give up less rights to their work. When you write and you are published, what kind of rights do you retain as an author?
Did I say that a self-published writer gives up less rights? You would have to retain, a self-published author would retain all the rights.
Right.
Okay, and then with a publisher, that will vary a great deal. And that's why I chose to hire an agent after I got a contract with this last one, because it was like 10 pages and everything was about the rights. So it can vary. I mean, it's all broken down into like film rights and this rights and that rights. And the publisher that I have for the book that's currently out was like a one-page paragraph that said what percentage of the royalties I get, and I retain all creative control of it. So we're talking the whole gamut, and so that's why the contract part is really important. The independent small presses will tend to give the writer more rights, and the bigger ones will tend to have take more of the rights. Does that make sense? Okay, in general. But that's why if it's a big, thick contract, you would want an agent or a lawyer.
Okay, here's another question. At several writers' conferences I've been at, they've said a lot of people have a book in them and then they're out trying to sell their concept to the publisher. They said if you really want to get published, go to the publishers and see what they want and then write a book, that is something, instead of having an itch to scratch, a scratch to itch, or whatever. If you could talk about that.
Yeah, no, that's really excellent. And it goes back to, are you a writer who has something to write? Nothing's stopping you from doing that. Or do you just want to be published? And if you just want to be published, then that advice is correct. There are a lot of people who are good writers and just want to write and don't, and could write a lot of things. I've done some things that were by assignment that weren't my idea, and I just took the challenge and did it. So either one could work. And there are actually, and I don't know a lot about these, but there's something called a content farm or something. Like a lot of the things that are online are just people hired to write things that they might not know anything about. And they just do the research and they write it, and it's for some of these other like in-house publications. Or I have a former student who writes a lot of. She was an English major, but she writes a lot of things for a real estate market newsletter, and she just answered an ad somewhere and started writing it and researched it, and she gets paid to do that. So great point. It could work either way, depending on what you really want to do. Other questions? Somebody, I don't know if he's here, but somebody on Twitter told me he was going to ask a question. Are you here? Like a few days ago?
No, that might have been me.
Was that about how I started writing? Yeah, okay. All right. Okay, well, you'll be next. Okay, good.
I was just curious if you have any knowledge or experience about e-publishing. Would that fall more under the category of, like for Kindles and stuff, would that fall under self-publishing?
Oh, yeah. Obviously, I have no knowledge of that because I didn't bring it up. No. No, that is a new thing. And I know a blogger I know got contacted by a service at Amazon, and she was asked, do you want to turn your blog into an ebook? And I really don't know that much about it. I think it would be a form of self-publishing, and it's probably a hybrid thing where Amazon is going to get a cut. They're just basically, they have nothing to lose because they have the technology, and they're like, well, yeah, if she turns into a runaway writer, we'll get some profit or whatever. So I think it is a form of some other people might know more than I do about this, but it is a kind of hybrid self-publishing service. And the other thing I want to say about self-publishing, this is why it's important. And again, I don't mean to dismiss it or be overly negative, but you just have to understand what it is. I was at a fundraiser, and one of my books was like a prize, and so they gave away the prize, and then the lady who won it was next to me, which was kind of awkward. And then she said, I don't know why, it was just awkward. That was just me. She didn't make it awkward, but she said she wanted to be a writer, and she said, yeah, and she goes, I've got a lot of publishers coming after me, and I'm like, really? And she goes, yeah. She goes, but I can't afford them. This was a very innocent, sweet lady, and I felt really bad because she did not know what self-publishing was. She didn't know they were trying to sell her something, and she felt like a lot of publishers were coming out, and that was just that. That's made me very sad, and that's why I wanted to bring up. There's nothing wrong with self-publishing, but you have to know what it is, and that it's that it's your investment, and it's someone selling you something. And if you're smarter than they are, and you know more of what you're doing, then great, more power to you. But don't misunderstand it for what it is, because that's just exploitation, as far as I'm concerned.
One thing with the e-publishing, you don't have boxes of books in your garage.
Right. Exactly. And I have been involved in an ebook, but I didn't. Yeah, I just wrote an article for it, so I don't know that much about it. Yes.
The question kind of has like two parts to it, but one is how did you get involved in writing for different press organizations? I know you write for Relevant and The Atlantic and stuff like that, but also how could a student at 21 that's still learning at the journalism or English or whatever, how can they start to get involved or get their foot in the door?
Okay.
Also?
Very good question. All right. So I started writing when I was in college letters to the editor, okay, to the local newspaper. And then I started writing, this is like before, this might be before the internet, okay. And then I started writing little articles for anybody who would have me. And never in it for the money, still not in it for the money, don't ever be in it for the money. And then started writing for a little newsletter here, a little newsletter there, and then querying bigger magazines here and there. And then, and this is the honest to God's truth, and if I had more time to talk about this, I would, because it's really, I'm passionate about this idea of vocation and calling, okay? And then the short story is that I was contacted out of the blue by the editor, the former editor for hermeneutics, who is now the editor of the magazine, who I met a different editor at a conference that had nothing to do with writing. And I was contacted by the editor and asked, because she'd seen it, because I'd written enough out there that she could go out and see it when I didn't know she was looking, invited me to query her and pitch. And so, and that's how I got published. And then after writing for hermeneutics for about 2 years, the editor from The Atlantic contacted me and said she wanted me to write for them. So that's not to say that you should not be aggressive and assertive and out there, but if you're doing good work and you are finding your voice and you are being faithful and you're not in it for the wrong reasons, just keep doing that and the doors will be opening. And I don't think you have to force it.